Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Netroots Nation panel on student debt cancellation. First of all, thank you everyone for attending. My name is Richard Eskow, also called RJ Eskow. I host a television and radio program called The Zero Hour. I'm also a writer and recovering policy nerd, I guess you'd say. We have a fantastic panel today, and we have an enormous amount of information to cover. So for the full detail on our panelists, I invite you to take a look at the app or the website. But we'll be going over the story of the last 5 years in the student debt cancellation movement. I got involved around then when I met a couple people named Stephen and Mary Swig who were interested in the issue. At that time, the idea of canceling student debt seemed unbelievable, seemed like a pipe dream. It's become part of our political debate now, thanks in large part to the members of this great panel. So I want to get to them without any further ado. So, and it looks like we may, at this very moment, be missing our first panelist, in which case I'm going to have to improvise. David Bergeron, are you there?
I am here, Richard.
Oh, okay. For some reason, you vanished off my screen here. So let me introduce the whole panel very quickly, and then we'll get to the history of how we got to where we are. I'm going to ask the panelists initially to stick to at least 5 to 7 minutes. David Bergeron is a senior fellow for post-secondary education at the Center for American Progress. He held a variety of senior positions in the Department of Education. I know this stuff backwards and forwards. So logically, the first question I guess one would ask is about the history. So before we get to David, I also want to introduce our other guests. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal needs no introductions, but I will give her a brief one. She is, of course, a member of the House of Representatives. She is a leader in the Progressive Caucus on the Hill. She is also very forward-thinking in looking at, because we had a lovely discussion about this once, the inside-outside relationship between movement activists and elected officials. So we're delighted to have her. Professor Darrick Hamilton is an internationally recognized scholar in the field of what's known as stratification economics. He's going to be discussing the racial wealth gap, among other things, and its implications in terms of student debt. And last but certainly not least, Professor Stephanie Kelton. Dr. Kelton is one of our leading proponents and thinkers on monetary theory in general, and is particularly known for her expertise in modern monetary theory. She has also studied student debt and was the lead author in a groundbreaking macroeconomic study on it. So with all that said, we're going to try to fast forward through a complex issue in the next 50 minutes or so. And with that, we'll start with the history. So first of all, David Bergeron, welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Richard. This is David Bergeron. Way back in 1977, I wrote a letter to then President Jimmy Carter expressing concerns about the levels of student loan debt that my friends were taking on, and at a time when the economy was not moving forward particularly well. Little did I know that that would really start 4 decades of work on student loan debt, during which time I've only seen it get worse. And it wasn't going so well in 1977. As I said, we're coming out of an economic downturn. Unemployment was still hovering around 6%. Debt levels were rising as Pell Grants were already falling behind college costs. Interest rates were at historic highs. The Fed interest rate at the time was 20%. More than that, people in higher education had already begun to forget why we got into student loans in the first place. Student loans were not introduced into our higher education financing system until the 1950s with the National Defense Education Act, and it was an experiment. It was an experiment to see whether or not the federal government could get people to go into STEM and to go into teaching with those loans being able to be canceled if the borrower, if the student went into those fields. And so the goal of student loans was to forgive them. And, you know, today, behavioral economists would call this nudging. Since we have two economists on the panel, I figured I should throw something in that sounded like I know about something about economics. But that idea that we could nudge people into certain fields or into teaching using loan forgiveness as a mechanism was something that by the 1970s had largely started to be forgotten. And so over many years, there were attempts to fix the deficits in the student loan system. And both Republicans and Democrats tried to fix the system. So in the 1960s, part of the fixing the system was to introduce private lenders into the system. In the intervening years, we saw changes that were punitive. We saw changes to the bankruptcy code to make it nearly impossible for student loans to be discharged. We saw administrative wage garnishment, where people could have their income seized. We saw federal benefits, Social Security, tax refunds seized. And we saw efforts that bordered on criminalizing non-payment of student loans. And this occurred gradually over decades, where almost every year Congress made changes to the student loan system in budget reconciliation provisions to raise revenue. At the same time, we did see attempts to improve the lives of borrowers. We saw income-based repayment options introduced. We saw them attempts to improve them over time. We saw expanded repayment through service. We saw pushing banks out of the student loan system. We saw lowering interest rates. Yes, interest rates were higher in the past. All of these changes, for better or for worse, were tinkering on the margin of what was the most serious flaw in the student loan system, which was student loans were never envisioned by the people who authored them in the 1950s, 1960s, and into the 1970s as a way to principally finance higher education for low and middle income students. They were seen as a tool that could be used to help finance cash flow for more affluent borrowers and to provide access to private institutions for more middle income students. And what happened along the way is we trapped students and then borrowers in decades of repayment, and with that infringed on their ability to do really basic things like get married, have kids, buy homes, start small businesses, or run for political office. So what happened as student loans grew, we saw states move back from free and low-cost options in higher education. We saw the federal government move back from providing grant aid. We saw instead those borrowers, individuals taking on more debt, and we saw loans that were intended to supplement for middle income students really become the principal source of revenue, both for public and private higher education, to the detriment of students and their families. So now we've got a broken system that we desperately need to repair. And you know, I hope the rest of this panel, we talk about the repairs that we can make.
Thank you so much, David. And now just some brief comments from me on the moral case for student debt cancellation, which is my topic on this panel. A couple things for context. One, you know, David gave the history of what I know he sometimes refers to and we refer to as a failed social experiment. It was this it's almost a social engineering idea that people will borrow, but they'll have a motivation to have it forgiven. It didn't work that way. Instead, the student loan system metastasized into something that was serving multiple functions, led to budget cuts in other areas, you know, education finance and so on. So now we have a situation where some 47 million Americans owe, you know, $1.7 trillion or so in student debt, just a phenomenal amount of burden, as David said, to the formation of households for young people, even going on into senior years. There are people on Social Security having their Social Security payments garnished for their own education, not their children's. So, you know, two contexts for the movement to cancel student debt cancellation. One is the belief, I have absolute faith and belief that Representative Jayapal and our other progressive elected leaders are going to create tuition-free higher education in this country, are going to restore it. It was something like that was available when I was going to college, and I'm not that old. I mean, I got a scholarship and there was jubilation in the Eskow household because it was going to save us $250 a semester in tuition, which is what, $1,500 now or something. So it wasn't free, but it was much more affordable. We believe that will happen again, but then you have these people trapped in the middle, these 47 million people with onerous student debt. They did what we, the American people, we, the society, told them to do. We said this for many years to our young people: get an education, borrow if you need to. It is an investment. Now, leaving aside the question of whether education should be an investment, I mean, there's value in learning and art and so on for their own sakes, even as an investment, in many cases at least, we misled them. We, the society, misled them because there's a lot of evidence that it doesn't pay off the way people were told it would pay off. We abandoned what is arguably a centuries-long endeavor on the part of the United States of expanding access to education, expanding access to knowledge, expanding access to investment. The Massachusetts Bay Colony formed a college for that reason, open to all qualified students, regardless of income. That was in the 1600s. Then we got into primary school, then secondary school, then land-grant colleges, and so on. So we abandoned that growing commitment to further education among our people, a commitment we made many years ago because we understood that we all benefit from a more educated population and people with vocational skills who have also been damaged in this process. So the moral argument, in a sense, boils down to a simple one. Let's make this right. Education is a public good. We treated it as something else. A lot of people got caught with burdensome debt. They shouldn't have. They had no alternative. We hope they will in the future. But as we build to make that possible, let's make sure that this debt is freed up because it's the right thing to do and because it will benefit everyone, especially with economic growth and job creation. which is our next topic. So with that, I would like to and I hope I didn't violate, I don't think I did. I think I kept to my own rules, which is good. I would feel terrible if I hadn't. So with that, we will turn to Professor Stephanie Kelton, whose study on this for the Levy Institute really contributed to the discussion enormously. So Dr. Kelton, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. So this is Stephanie Kelton, and I want to start I want to echo what Richard has said, because he emphasized what I think are two really important points. When he says we all benefit, he's not just talking about the benefits from higher education, from having an educated population and so forth, but he also said we all benefit from student debt cancellation. And that's really, I think, one of the most important findings that came out of this report that Richard is referring to. This is a report that was published back in February of 2018. And I had a number of co-authors on this report. And you know, when we first started to work on this question, we approached this really, in a sense, agnostically. Okay, we didn't know the answer to the question that we were asking. The question was, what would be the macroeconomic effects of canceling what was then all outstanding $1.2 trillion of student loan debt? That's what it was when we started the project. It took us about 1.5 years to complete the report. It's a kind of beefy report. It's 60-some pages. By the time we finished, we were up to 1.6 trillion. And as Richard has said today, we're looking at about 1.7 trillion. So this is a problem that compounds over time. It doesn't go away. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And, you know, as Richard said, what we're talking about is a population that essentially got trapped historically between an era in which it was basically possible to go to college and get an education tuition free, and maybe a future, I hope, and I know Richard hopes, a not too distant future where that's going to be possible again. So what you have is this cohort in the middle that was saddled with student loan debt through a series, I would say, of policy failures, not just policy failures of the kind that David and Richard already talked about, the way that we have approached the funding of higher education, but also broader macroeconomic policy failures, the Great Recession, and the time it took for people who were in college, entering college, coming out of college during those years in a very anemic economy where job opportunities were scarce, jobs that were available paid far less than people expected to be paid. Graduating into a depressed economy, we know, reduces incomes by some 10 to 15% relative to what they would have been paid if they had graduated into a good economy. So when we talk about canceling student loan debt, what we did in this report, just very quickly, is we just asked the hypothetical question, right? What would happen if somehow, some way, we could make it all go away? And then we go through the mechanics of how to actually do that, right? How to eliminate student loan debt. But what are the benefits to the economy? The benefits to the individual are obvious, right? You no longer have to take out that checkbook every month and write a big check paying back a portion of the principal and interest on your student loan balance. Instead, you can do something else with that freed up cash flow. So canceling student loan debt does two things for the individual borrower. There's an income effect. It frees up disposable income, which can be used in other ways. You could pay down other kinds of debt, you could consume, you could save some money. And then there's a wealth effect. And I think probably Professor Hamilton is going to talk about the impacts on wealth, and especially the racial wealth gap when we get to him. But there's a wealth effect because you are eliminating a significant liability off of the balance sheet of the borrower. And immediately you have improved that individual's net worth, right? Their net worth is improved. So for both of those reasons, you would expect that people would do a variety of things, including spending more into the economy. So the benefits that we found in the report are that in just the first few years of cancellation, you add about 1.5 million new private sector jobs, which is a big boost. As people's income is freed up and they begin spending into the economy, it helps to support other jobs. And that, I think, is Richard's point when he says, you know, it's not just good for the 45 or 47 million people who are saddled, who are trapped with student loan debt. It's good for the rest of us as well, because it helps to perpetuate demand and to support the economy more broadly, to support jobs in the economy more broadly. What we found in the report also was that this could be done with minimal side effects of the kind that might concern anyone. No material increase in inflation. You can cancel student loan debt, free up income, allow people to spend more into the economy. And by the way, you know, we were writing this report and publishing this in a very different economic environment, right? We had a labor market that looked much, much closer to something we might be willing to call full employment than what we're facing today. So even back then, canceling student loan debt carried significant economic benefits in an economy that was already doing reasonably well. Today, doing something like this would only amplify those positive benefits, right? Because now more than ever, we need to be doing the kinds of things that are going to help restore growth, support incomes, and jobs in this economy. So I'm going to stop. I might have ticked over by 1 minute. I apologize, but those are just general remarks.
You did fine. Thank you,
Okay.
Dr. Kelton. And you know, one of the things you hear and read, despite Dr. Kelton's research and others, is that a lot of people react by saying, well, you know, canceling student debt, I don't want to help some, you know, white orthodontists on Long Island or whatever. You know, you get that kind of argument. It's going to benefit the wealthy and the white disproportionately. Now, it could be argued, first of all, that they're genuinely wealthy don't take out student loans because they don't need to. And by the way, there's a family of orthodontists with my last name, Eskow, but they're not related, so that doesn't pose a conflict of interest. I want to say that. But to this argument that regarding the racial wealth gap, and I don't know of anyone better positioned to address that than Professor Darrick Hamilton. So Professor Hamilton, over to you.
Well, thank you. This is Darrick Hamilton speaking, and I'm grateful to be on this panel. So I thank my co-panelists, and I especially thank Representative Jayapal, sorry, my apology, for her leadership in Congress, and not only this bill, but also the timely bill with regards to a paycheck guarantee when we're considering this next round of CARES Act. So thank you for all of that. And what better way to start thinking about solutions than history itself? It's critical to note that it was never the case that a white asset-based middle class simply emerged. Rather, it was government policy, and to a large extent, literally government giveaways or entitlements that provided whites with the finance, the education, the land, the infrastructure to accumulate and pass down wealth. Ira Katznelson, in his aptly titled book, When Affirmative Action Was White, documents that by 1950, the GI Bill alone generated more spending on higher education than the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe. However, by both design and implementation, Black students and Black institutions, like HBCUs, they were largely frozen out of these benefits. The outright refusal of many white colleges to admit Black students, coupled with the constraints on the growth of HBCs and a far narrow access to federal subsidies, all products of public policy, dramatically restricted the capacity of Black Americans and Black institutions to build wealth, secure college education, and pass this down generationally. Now, if we fast forward today, not only have young millennials taken out an enormous amount of student debt, their home ownership rate, the element of wealth in which most Americans store their wealth, is lower than that of every generation at a similar age, dating back 100 years to the greatest generation, which was a generation of young people just starting their adulthood right after the Great Depression. They came along of age during the last Great Recession. As Stephanie pointed out, we told them to go to college and better themselves while they waited out the Great Recession. And now that scarring effect is going to be even more amplified as we consider this pandemic and the recession that it has brought about. But what's even worse is that the racial disparity in home ownership for young millennials compared to similarly aged generations, as long as we've been collecting data by race and home ownership, has never been as large as it has been today. In terms of debt, what we traditionally conceive of as good and bad debt has different implications once we consider race and the prevailing frameworks of targeting unprivileged racial groups with inferior housing and education products, predatory finance, as well as ongoing housing and labor market discrimination that limits the choice sets and the rates of return to home ownership and a college degree by one's race and or ethnicity. Our alarming trend in student indebtedness in the context of stagnating wages and growing income and wealth inequality, it points to an unjust economic vulnerability. And in the aftermath of the Great Recession and now this pandemic, it is only going to accelerate that vulnerability. That is, if we do nothing. We have power to change this destiny. Fewer Black students begin college and even fewer graduate, and those that graduate carry much more debt than their white counterparts. The good news is that change may be happening. We have social movements like Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and the clamoring for a strike against fossil fuel by younger generations. This might be indicative of our notions of changing our how we define economic good to incorporate principles of morality, sustainability, and our common humanity. These values are necessary ingredients if we are going to get to an authentic coalition across race, across gender, across sexual orientation to address our common paradigm of growing inequality. What we need is something analogous to Medicare for All, where we could remove the threat and social and psychological stigma associated with the burden of finance at the point of delivery of education, a point in which highly motivated and low resource students, it's when they're most vulnerable. And we can pursue a restorative justice of canceling all the debt associated with that existing educational loan burdens. We could make all public colleges, community colleges, universities, and HBCUs tuition free. In other words, we could establish higher education as a universal economic right. So some people have argued for partial loan cancellation, but when considering partial debt cancellation, by the way, I am in favor of full-throated full cancellation. It's noteworthy that the average Black college graduate still owes in excess of $50,000 in student debt 4 years after graduation. In contrast, the average white graduate carries about $30,000 in debt 4 years after graduation. This suggests that a capped debt forgiveness plan would completely wipe out a good portion of the white graduates' debt, while a substantial portion of the population of Black graduates would still remain indebted. There's an argument for full cancellation that full cancellation would favor whites as it relates to the racial wealth gap. The evidence here is mixed at best, but there's a compelling recent study by Marshall Steinbaum which finds the opposite, that full cancellation of student debt would reduce the racial wealth disparity between Black and white students. But here's the real problem with that argument. It confuses the urgent problem of rising and unjust student debt with reducing the racial wealth disparity between Black and white students. The real problem is the urgent problem of rising unjust student, the real problem is relieving student debt is not the main policy tool for eliminating the racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap has more to do with a lack of assets among Black families than abundance of debt. Now, debt creates sharecropping phenomena where you continue to work to try to pay back finance in order to climb out of debt. But at the end of the day, the racial wealth gap has a lot more to do with asset disparity than debt disparity. This is not to say that there's no connection between student debt and the racial wealth gap. Families with outsized financial advantages, they can buy crucial additional advantages for their children, such as the ability to obtain a college degree without accruing costly educational debt. Lack of wealth, primarily inherited wealth, prevents many Black families from ever exercising that type of advantage. Canceling student debt and providing a universal pathway for everyone to have a debt-free college education, it is the just and moral thing to do, period. That should be the only reason and the necessary reason why we need to do it, especially if we want to evolve into a 21st century economy that is grounded in morality and that is aimed at promoting our shared prosperity.
Thank you, Professor Hamilton. And all the great work that everybody on this panel has done has created, at least I think of it this way, it has created a political space where action can occur. But for that political action to take place, it takes leadership in the political sphere, which gets me to our next and last panelist, Representative Jayapal. We look forward to your comments on this topic, so please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And what a fantastic panel and history on so many different pieces. And thank you, Professor Hamilton, for lifting up particularly the effects on our BIPOC communities. You know, our young people today, I think, are bearing the brunt of policies that have created the society that is a me first society instead of a we first society. And it's more apparent than ever as we face this public health and economic crisis that has now taken more American lives than we lost during World War I and the Vietnam War, and tens of millions of Americans who have filed for unemployment, you know, tens of millions more who have lost their health insurance because of the cruel for-profit system that ties health insurance to jobs. And all of that work has just exacerbated so much that we saw before. It's hard to get a leg up in society without a post-secondary education. That's the clear truth of today. And it was something that my father knew when he sent me to the United States by myself at the age of 16 to get a college education. As a foreign student, you don't get much financial aid, so we had to work and we had to pay scholarships. But the reality was we knew that that education was going to give opportunity to me that I wouldn't otherwise have. And so when you look at the student debt crisis, like so many other things that inequality touches, I think of it as an oppression of young people of color, an oppression of people who are low income and even middle income families, shutting them out from the benefits that American higher education can and should offer. I really got involved in this issue back in 2014. I had just entered the state Senate, and as I was running for the state Senate, I started looking at the research of what it meant to get an education, something that was so important for me. And I realized how outrageous the situation was. I introduced a bill back then, a fairly moderate bill, I thought, to just make community colleges and technical colleges free and to forgive some of the debt that was already there. People called me crazy back then, but that, of course, is what it means to be a progressive. We are just the first to the best and most just idea. In 2016, when I was running for Congress, student debt became a major theme of my campaign. And of course, there was a guy running for president named Bernie Sanders who was running on a similar platform. Now, I will say that at the time, our focus was primarily prospective. We did have details about how we would cut interest rates and things like that, but it was really how to deal with the issue of kids not being deterred from getting a higher education. This is, as many of our panelists have said, a uniquely American crisis. More than 45 million Americans hold a collective debt of $1.7 trillion. You heard from Stephanie Kelton about how that number just keeps increasing. Every year that we're doing our research and talking about it, that number is increasing. That is more than the total amount of US credit card debt. And public colleges and universities are already tuition free in most of the advanced countries that we can think of, countries like Germany and Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. So the cancel student debt movement, which has been supported by, of course, both Senator Sanders and also Senator Warren during the presidential campaign, has continued to gain strength as we have had the research of academics like Professors Hamilton and Kelton showing us that it is not only a good moral issue, not only is it important to the future of America's leadership in the world, but it actually makes economic sense. And it has gained strength and momentum because today's young people, frankly, are fed up. They're fed up of the debt, but they're also crippled by the lack of opportunity that they face when they stay in their parents' home, when their grandparents become, seniors become one of the faster growing segments that have student debt because they are taking on the debt of young people. And even before the COVID crisis hit, young people were already being forced to make untenable choices. Now, they are also facing this massive unemployment, of course, disproportionately going to hit Black and brown folks and Indigenous folks. And the reality is that this is a moment for us to take really bold action as we go into this next presidency. I have introduced a College for All bill with Senator Sanders that is about the prospective issues. How do we make sure that education going forward is really free and also invests in those community colleges and four-year universities that need the investment after decades of austerity spending, and put specific attention on those Black, brown, and Indigenous communities and lower income communities that need help. Also, I'm a proud original co-sponsor of Representative Omar's bill to cancel student debt, something that has been made possible by the research and by the movement on the ground to move the limits of what is seen as possible. And maybe I'll end there by saying that, I have always said that if politics is the art of the possible, then it is our job as activists, as researchers, as elected officials to move the boundaries of what is seen as possible. And you got at this, RJ, when you talked a little bit about this. What is now seen as possible is different than it was 4 years ago, thanks to the movement. But we have a lot of work to do to make sure that when we address this issue, we address it both retrospectively, looking at all the people that are trapped with student debt, and we address it prospectively. And that is going to take a lot of work and a lot of movement building. I'm looking forward to helping to lead that work in Congress, but also helping our movement on the ground to continue to make the case for the urgency of addressing this, including as a way to come out of the economic crisis that we find ourselves in.
Thank you so much, Representative Jayapal. And we find ourselves now at and this is Richard Eskow. I'm sorry, closed captioning, been instructing everyone state your name before you speak, and I haven't been doing it, so I apologize. This is Richard Eskow and RJ Eskow, and in the question, I guess I want to open up the discussion portion of this in this way. We've talked a lot about college graduates, but most people in this country don't graduate, are not college graduates, if I recall my statistics correctly. So while that is an important segment, of course, of the population, I guess I want to go back and revisit a little bit what student cancellation does for people who are not college graduates, for people maybe who just got a high school education, for people who maybe did part college but didn't finish, for people who perhaps had vocational training at a community college or elsewhere. What does what used to be called the blue collar segment of the population, I have some thoughts on it, but I'd rather hear from the panel, anyone who wants to comment. What would student debt cancellation do for the blue collar population in this country? Dr. Kelton, maybe?
I'll say something. This is Stephanie Kelton. Well, okay, so first, just to state the obvious, I guess, which is that completion rates and the percentage of the population with a college degree would surely be higher if we had public colleges and universities tuition free, and if debt was not such an important part of, you know, how we finance education today. So there are a whole lot of people who may be blue collar workers today by virtue of the fact that college is simply out of reach for those folks. But cancellation has direct and secondary effects. And as I said in my remarks earlier, there is a direct benefit to the person who no longer has to take out the checkbook and write that check. But as I also said, they get to do something else with that money. So let's say you're a waitress in a restaurant. Yeah, and you say, well, how does student debt cancellation help me? That's helping the guy with the student loan debt or the gal with the student loan debt. Well, but wait, what happens is that person now has some freed up income. So maybe their budget is so tight that they can't afford to eat out very often, or when they do eat out, they can't afford to leave a very generous tip. So you free up some cash flow for people who are trapped with student loan debt, and all of a sudden they've got some extra money that they can go out and spend into local shops. They can eat a meal, they can leave a more generous tip. And so that's just a very kind of simple but obvious example of the secondary effects of canceling student loan debt and how they bleed through the economy. And this is why, you know, our research found that cancellation results in the creation of millions of additional jobs, and by the way, also increases wages a bit across the economy. Not a lot, but there is some increased wage pressure simply by virtue of the fact that you're running the economy hotter. You have a better labor market, and that gives workers a little bit of additional boost in their take-home pay.
RJ, I'll just
Yes.
say that, you know, we have a fairly strong community college, technical college system in Washington State. And just to go to Stephanie's first point, I do think it's important to state that a lot of people that didn't complete had to face a choice of paying rent or paying their student debt or their tuition and paying their loans. And so I think that we cannot gloss over that fact that if you were to cancel student debt, I believe, and I don't know if, you know, how much in-depth research has been done around this. Maybe we can ask our economists to do this, but I actually believe that you might have people, depending on where they are in their life, deciding to complete whatever it was that they left, or to go for further training that they could not even begin to imagine. And I think that is where debt cancellation and how it ties to possibility of opportunity is so central to this whole conversation. And it is why we have to do so much, because the future is bleak. I have a 23-year-old who's now on unemployment, spent 3 months trying to get a job, just got a job, I'm very happy to say. But, you know, this is a difficult time for people. And whatever age category you're in, whether you're in the category of people who are not even contemplating getting a higher education or continued education of any kind, or whether you're in the category of grandparents worrying about their grandkids, or right in the middle of those people that really got caught and now are so up to their ears that they cannot possibly imagine even some things like starting a family or buying a home or buying a car. So it really does have effects across the spectrum. And I think you would see substantial increases in completion rates if you address both the debt cancellation and the future college tuition.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of quick points on race. One is a main source of why Black students don't complete college once they enroll is finance, is the cost of attending college. So that's really bad when people start college and aren't able to finish, and we saddle them with debt, but they're not able to finish because they don't have the finance to complete. And then also in the racial dimension, thinking about a little bit of the flip side of that question, some other misperceptions is that, you know, some people make the argument, well, are we financing and helping graduate school education in a way that privileges white students over Black students? So another misperception is that of students that graduate from college, a Black student is more likely to go to graduate school. Blacks have a higher proportion of graduate enrollment than their enrollment in the population at large. And that becomes another element by which they accumulate debt, and they very well might be trying to go to graduate school to overcome some racial discrimination that takes place in the labor market. In other words, in the pursuit of a resume building strategy to overcome structural barriers, we also impose upon certain stigmatized populations the burden of debt to overcome those barriers.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Hamilton. I guess the one issue we haven't really discussed, and it's hanging over us like a tidal wave, of course, is the pandemic. And we've only mentioned it in passing, but maybe I'll start the question with Representative Jayapal and then perhaps Dr. Kelton. But you have your bill on free higher education with Senator Sanders. You are original co-sponsor of Representative Omar's bill on cancellation. How, if at all, has that changed the political discussions, the cloakroom discussions, if you will, among your colleagues of the concept of student debt cancellation in particular?
Well, I think that, you know, the relief packages have put forward some levels of student debt cancellation, not just forgiveness, not just moratorium, but forgiveness. But I think that, you know, my belief is that we have not addressed this crisis at the scale that we need to. This will take massive investments to both make up for everything that we were dealing with around austerity spending before we ever had the pandemic hit, but now also everything that has happened since the pandemic. So Darrick mentioned that I have a Paycheck Recovery Act. I mean, I think this has to be a comprehensive set of approaches. It's not going to be, we're just going to address student debt cancellation and then everything's going to be fine here. I mean, we need to, you know, we know that sending people, I'm in big favor of expanding unemployment, extremely important, but we all know that long-term unemployment disproportionately affects folks of color. Those are the exact people that have a hard time getting back into the employment marketplace because of the discrimination that Professor Hamilton has spoken about. And so we are going to need to think about recovery in multiple ways. Yes, we're going to have to forgive a lot of debt, rent payments, mortgage payments. We need to get money to people on a regular basis. A $1,200 stimulus check once is not going to do anything, frankly. It just doesn't get us to the scale we need. We need money in people's pockets. It's why I proposed Paycheck Recovery, which is the subsidization of 100% of wages from IRS directly to the business, directly to the worker. It keeps people on their benefits, and it allows businesses to not have to make a case to shutter. But those are all of the things, if you think about it, that add to, if you've got student debt and you're not paying it, it's continuing. If you're thinking about going to college and you were stocking away some money so you could do that, you're not doing that anymore. So I think we have to look at recovery, not only from the perspective of one thing that we're gonna have to do, but really, how do we get money back into people's pockets, recognize that that immediately flows back into the economy and is gonna be an investment for a quicker recovery, but also for the protection of the lives and the opportunities of so many people, particularly low-income folks and folks of color.
Thank you so much for that. We have about 2 minutes left. Are there any brief points that anybody wanted to make and didn't get a chance to make before we wrap it up? No, you got it all in and those.
Can I, this is Stephanie Kelton. I just wanted to drop a few names. I'm going to be a name dropper because there are some people, some activists who have worked so hard on this issue, so many, many years before this ever hit my radar. And I just want to give them some credit for the work that they've done to make student debt and student debt cancellation the issue that I think it is today. Those are people like Laura Hanna, Astra Taylor, Alexis Goldstein, and Ann Larson, people who are associated with groups like Strike Debt. And those ladies were doing incredible work on the ground for years, elevating this as an issue. And I just wanted them to have their shout out because they deserve it.
Okay, great. And let's not forget Freedom to Prosper, which is a group that I mentioned at the beginning. For more information on this topic and that organization. It's www.freedomtoprosper.org. And with that, I want to thank everybody for participating. It was an excellent session. I don't know if I was supposed to learn a lot, but I learned a lot, and I hope others did as well. So Representative Jayapal, Professor Hamilton, David Bergeron, Stephanie Kelton. I didn't leave anybody out, did I? And then just myself, I'm Richard R.J. Eskow. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Netroots Nation for allowing us to present this panel. And now go out there and cancel student debt.